Things are heating up in the graphics card space as today sees NVIDIA dropping their latest offering in the 50 series lineup, the RTX 5070 Ti, a GPU that NVIDIA claim is set to give users who are still rocking an RTX 3070 Ti a reason to upgrade through uplifts in performance and the latest features like DLSS 4 with multi-frame generation. Though at $749 and with AMD's 9000 series on the horizon, it's already starting off on the back foot. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of gains the new Blackwell-based GPU brings us over not only its Ampere predecessor, but also what increase we see generation on generation when comparing it to its Ada Lovelace brother, the RTX 4070 Ti. But before we get into all of that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Oi oi, I hear you're in the market for a proper top-of-the-line monitor. Best blacks, brightest whites, sharper than a tailor's crease, am I right?
Yeah, that's the one.
Well, look no further, my son. Feast your peepers on this, the Glare 5000, a true marvel of technology. Just, maybe don't use it when the sun's out.
What? That's not what I want. I was after a 32-inch 4K 165Hz QD OLED with adaptive sync.
Cool, blimey, we've got a right tech connoisseur here. You don't mess about, do you? All right. I see where you're coming from. Forget the Glare Master, that was just a warm-up. What you need, my friend, is the Aegon Pro AG326UD from AOC. Top tier gear, 4K, 165Hz, QD OLED, all the bells and whistles. And get this, HDR 400 certified. That's the real deal, no mucking about.
That does sound good.
Of course it does. I wouldn't steer you wrong, would I? I'm all about quality, me. Now, if you want to get your hands on one of these beauties, you know what to do. To find out more, click the link in the description below. You won't regret it, my son. Lovely jubbly. Okay, so before we get things started, I want to put a small caveat on this review because our RTX 5080 review was nearly an hour long. And while we at eTeknix believe it was one of the most well-rounded reviews on the internet, it was long and there was a lot involved in it. And being how we don't actually have a Founders Edition for the 5070 Ti, because they don't make one, I want to condense things down somewhat and focus purely on the GPU and not the MSI Ventus 3X cooler that I have here, as we'll have a separate feature specifically for that, drilling down into the cooler, the overclocking potential, and all of that good stuff. Though I'll say for now that I believe most media outlets are getting the same card, so that should make it easy for you to at least compare to other reviews and see how things line up. Now, before we get into the benchmarks, let's talk about specs, as the 5070 Ti does pack some power due to NVIDIA opting for the same GB203 core, just a slightly different variant with the GB203-200A1 compared to the GB203-400A1 on the RTX 5080. In terms of the nitty-gritty, that means we have the same die size at 378mm squared and the same 45.6 billion transistors. This means that the 5070 Ti comes in with 8,960 CUDA cores, which is a 17% increase from the 4070 Ti and a 46% uplift from the 3070 Ti. The same increases follow for the texture mapping units, streaming multiprocessors, Tensor cores and RT cores, and we also see a healthy uplift in the L2 cache, now matching the RTX 5080 at 64MB, compared to 48MB on the 4070 Ti and a lowly 4MB on the 3070 Ti. We also have 16GB of GDDR7 on a 256-bit bus, matching that of the RTX 5080, though with a slightly lower memory bandwidth of 896GB a second. This also means that we now have 6GB more than the 4070 Ti and double that of the 3070 Ti. So those looking for an upgrade from the 3070 Ti could see that as a huge selling point. And we all know the drama and everything that, well, revolved around the 4070 Ti when that launched. Or was it the 4080? Either way, in terms of clock speeds, the 5070 Ti comes in with a base clock of 2295MHz, a boost clock of 2452MHz, and a memory speed of 1750MHz, or 28GB per second effective. Though with the 3X OC model that we have here from MSI, we do see a slight increase in the boost clock to 2482MHz, with the same memory speed of 1750, and, well, all of this bundled up gives us a TDP of 300 watts. And for this card, NVIDIA recommend a 700-watt PSU as a minimum. Though as always, depending on your other components and, well, mainly your processor, I'd always recommend going slightly higher, around the 850-watt mark, to give yourself some headroom and, of course, to future-proof your system. So, on paper, there's, I guess, the steady flow of increases in specs that we'd expect generation to generation, and hopefully this all equates to a good, strong level of performance uplift as well. Now, speaking of performance, let's get into the reason that you're actually here, to see how the 5070 Ti does in a bunch of games. To test, we used our GPU benchmark system with an AMD Ryzen 7 9800X3D with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB, 6000MHz CL30 memory on a Gigabyte B650E Aorus Master motherboard. All testing was done on the latest version of Windows with the latest updates, and for our testing, we used the NVIDIA 572.43 Game Ready driver. We'll be mainly comparing to the 4070 Ti, 4070 Ti Super and 3070 Ti to see what kind of generational uplift we see, along with seeing how it compares to the 4080 series. We'll be looking at 1440p and 4K today, but we'll also be uploading the 1080p results onto our Patreon if you want to check them out, while also supporting the channel with everything that we do. So, with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So kicking things off with a synthetic test and 3D Mark Timespy, and it's here where the 5070 Ti comes in with 15% more performance in the overall score when compared to the 4070 Ti, 9% more than the 4070 Ti Super, and a very healthy 55% more than the 3070 Ti, which is the card that NVIDIA is hoping that consumers will be upgrading from. This also puts the 5070 Ti just 2% below the RTX 4080 and 1% ahead of the 7900 XT, though this is a synthetic test and doesn't always relate to what we see in real-world gaming performance. So for our first game, we ran a Plague Tale at 1440p, and straight away we can see that the 5070 Ti is nestled between the 4080 and 4080 Super, sitting just 3% behind the Super variant. This also puts it 25% ahead of the 4070 Ti, 17% ahead of the 4070 Ti Super, and 76% ahead of the RTX 3070 Ti, though the uplift in the lows over the 4070 Ti were much lower at just 5%, though this is something we've consistently seen across the 50 series, while it was much stronger over the 4070 Ti Super, which just seemed to lack somewhat. As we move up to 4K, the 5070 Ti still holds strong, placed again between the two 4080 series cards at 68 FPS. This puts it 28% ahead of the RTX 4070 Ti, 17% ahead of the Ti Super, and 74% ahead of the 3070 Ti, and is already looking to shape up to be a pretty impressive GPU, though we are only one game in at this point. In Alan Wake 2, the RTX 5070 Ti comes in very close to the RTX 4080, separated by just 2 FPS in favour of the more expensive card, which equates to the newer 5070 Ti sitting just 2% slower, which given the price point is, well, perfectly fine for me. This does mean that we see an 18% uplift over the 4070 Ti, a 13% increase over the Ti Super, and a pretty huge 90% faster than the 3070 Ti, showing that NVIDIA's claim could be looking good for those wanting to skip the 40 series and go straight for this card. It's also nice to see the 1% lows coming in a lot stronger in this title and at this resolution. As we move up to 4K, it's a similar story with the more expensive but older RTX 4080 pushing ahead by a single FPS, showing that the 5070 Ti does have a value for money argument to talk about. This also sees an uplift of 19% over the 4070 Ti, 14% more performance over the 4070 Ti Super, and again another strong increase over the 3070 Ti of 92%. In Baldur's Gate 3, the 5070 Ti rivals the more expensive RTX 4080, falling just 2% behind, though it's still enough to see an 8% increase in performance over the 4070 Ti Super, which isn't groundbreaking but is still welcomed considering the lower launch pricing of this card. Compared to the 4070 Ti non-Super, we're now good for another 16% more frames, and more importantly, we see an uplift of 70% over the 3070 Ti from many years ago. At 4K, it's a similar story where the 5070 Ti comes in 5% behind the RTX 4080, while still packing another 10% more performance over the 4070 Ti Super, along with coming in 23% faster than the 4070 Ti. And, of course, looking at the 3070 Ti, we now get 65% more performance, so some fairly strong uplifts, though other titles should see a little wider margins. In Black Myth Wukong, the levels of performance versus the 4080 series still show some strong promise, though that is made stronger by the pretty terrible 1% low figure of our 4080, as the averages come in nigh on identical. This does mean that we see a smaller 11% increase over the 4070 Ti Super, though still have the 5070 Ti packing 17% more frames than the 4070 Ti non-Super, and a still impressive, though lesser than what we've seen in other games, 71% over the 3070 Ti. At 4K, the gap between the 5070 Ti and 4080 series cards does draw wider, though we're only talking around 2 FPS, but it's enough to see a 12% uplift over the 4070 Ti Super, 24% more than the 4070 Ti non-Super, and 77% more frames than the 3070 Ti. Though this time we do now see much stronger 1% low figures, which as I've mentioned before, I think really comes down to optimizations and driver updates. In Counter-Strike 2 at 1440p we are still quite limited by our processor, and there isn't really too much information to take away from the chart, though you could argue that it's a good way to show that the GPU is being pushed to its fullest, as the 5070 Ti lines up towards the top of our chart, though a higher resolution is always going to paint a clearer picture. It's here at 4K where we see exactly that. The 4080 in this game does push ahead by 8% and comes in with strong 1% lows to match, though the 5070 Ti still manages to command a 6% lead over the 4070 Ti Super, a 10% uplift over the 4070 Ti, and a 58% lead over the 3070 Ti, so not as much as we've seen, but still welcome nonetheless. Moving on to Cyberpunk at 1440p, and again it's very much the same. The 5070 Ti falls just behind the RTX 4080, though again the 1% lows seem to be improved a little in comparison. When looking at generation to generation, the 5070 Ti now comes in 13% faster than the 4070 Ti Super, 16% faster than the 4070 Ti, and 68% faster than the 3070 Ti. So not the strongest uplifts we've seen, but there's still enough of a boost to make an upgrade worthwhile for some users. At 4K again, we're only seeing a single FPS difference to the more expensive RTX 4080, along with a 15% increase in frames over the 4070 Ti Super, along with a healthier 21% over the 4070 Ti, and 62% more performance than the RTX 3070 Ti from yesteryear. That again makes it a meaningful upgrade for 30 series users, though 40 series owners may see fewer reasons to switch. Changing over to F124, and the 5070 Ti comes in punching, now sitting just 4% slower than the RTX 5080 and 2% above the 4080 Super, though that does put us into margin of error territory. That aside, we do see 15% more performance than the 4070 Ti Super, 16% more than the 4070 Ti non-Super, and 63% more than the 3070 Ti, though when we're talking 200 FPS or higher, it's nothing you'd notice in-game anyway. At 4K, the 7900 XTX manages to push ahead of the 5070 Ti, but we're talking negligible differences, though just outside of that realm is where the new Blackwell GPU sits ahead of the 4080 Super, with 4% more performance overall. It also means, in comparison to the 4070 Ti Super, that we now have a 19% uplift, a 26% increase over the 4070 Ti non-Super, and 80% higher frames than the 3070 Ti. Lastly, in Starfield at 1440p, the RTX 4080 again pushes ahead as the 5070 Ti falls 6% behind, though that's enough to give us a margin of error 4% lead over the 4070 Ti Super, a stronger but still not groundbreaking 6% lead over the 4070 Ti, and a 60% uplift over the RTX 3070 Ti, so not the strongest increases we've seen across games. At 4K, it's a similar story with the new Blackwell-based GPU slotting in 5% behind the RTX 4080, while still warranting a small but modest 7% lead over the 4070 Ti Super, and a better yet still not amazing 12% lead over the 4070 Ti, and comes in packing 70% more performance than the aging 3070 Ti. So some strong increases generation to generation in places, while other titles didn't give us anything above single-digit performance uplifts. Though the best way to see what this means across all of our games is, of course, to look at the overall averages. It's here where at 1080p we evidently have some bottlenecks, though that aside we do find the 5070 Ti coming in faster than the RTX 4080 by less than 1%, so nothing really in it. Though that is actually a good sign, especially given their launch prices. When looking at generational uplift, the 5070 Ti only comes in 5% faster than the 4070 Ti Super, and 7% faster than the 4070 Ti non-Super. Then, when seeing how things compare to the 3070 Ti, there's a 46% uplift overall, but there's a lot more to the story as we increase the resolution. When moving up to 1440p and looking at the RTX 4080, we're pretty evenly matched, though we do see slightly better low figures on the 5070 Ti in comparison. The 5070 Ti now comes in 8% faster than the 4070 Ti Super and 11% faster than the 4070 Ti non-Super, along with holding a 60% increase over the Ampere-based RTX 3070 Ti. So some increases, but nothing exactly groundbreaking. Now, one thing I do want to mention here is our 4080 Super results, which are swayed somewhat by CS2, as if we remove it we can see things change, well, quite dramatically, and now the 5070 Ti sits nestled between the RTX 4080 and 4080 Super, which is where I'd honestly expect it to be, given its price point and specs. Then at 4K, again, the 5070 Ti is pretty evenly matched with the RTX 4080 separated in the averages and the lows, so swings and roundabouts. This does mean that the 5070 Ti now sits 11% ahead of the 4070 Ti Super, 18% ahead of the 4070 Ti non-Super, and 68% ahead of the RTX 3070 Ti. Again, omitting CS2 from the averages does have an effect, which again puts the 5070 Ti just below the 4080 Super, but above the RTX 4080, which for a card that's meant to be $749, that's a good place to be. Now, as we move over to ray tracing performance, we turn to Port Royal as a synthetic test to make sure that performance aligns, and things are looking pretty good overall. The uplift from the 4070 Ti comes in strong at 30%, though the more impressive number comes from the increase from the Ampere predecessor, where the new 5070 Ti comes in packing 101% more performance, and this puts it pretty well aligned with the RTX 4080 Super, a card that was launched 33% more expensive. Booting back into Alan Wake 2, but now with ray tracing set to high and upscaling set to balanced, and at 1440p, the 5070 Ti takes an 8% back seat to the RTX 4080, though it does come in with fairly strong low figures in comparison, while also giving us a margin of error improvement of 4% over the 4070 Ti and 8% lead over the 4070 Ti Super. And retesting garnered the same result, so some slightly odd results for the 4070 Ti Super here, but at such small margins, there's not really much in it anyway. Now, what is worth talking about though is the huge uplift in ray tracing performance over the 3070 Ti to the tune of 206%, though that may be more of a testament as to how far behind the Ampere GPU is, more so than how far ahead the Blackwell-based 5070 Ti is. It's the same again as we move up to 4K, the 4070 Ti and the Super variant are separated by just 3 FPS, and retesting gave us the same result, so maybe our Ti model is just that good, and our Super card, well, isn't. Either way, our 5070 Ti sits just 1 FPS higher than the 4070 Ti, which is a bit of a moot point. Though again, we do see a strong 152% lead over the RTX 3070 Ti. So those looking to upgrade with more ray tracing performance are in for a bit of a treat there. Black Myth Wukong with ray tracing set to medium now has the 5070 Ti coming in 2% faster than the RTX 4080, but for the sake of margin of error, we'd class that as identical. Our 4070 Ti based cards seemingly have sorted themselves out now, as the Ti Super comes in higher and now sees our 5070 Ti packing 13% more frames, while compared to the 4070 Ti non-Super, we now have a healthy 24% faster performance, and this again gives us a strong lead over the 3070 Ti of 132%. At 4K, we're now matching the levels of performance of the RTX 4080, though we do still have a slight uptake in the 1% lows. And this means that we still see a 14% increase in frames over the 4070 Ti Super and a more impressive 39% over the non-Super based card. While when compared to the 3070 Ti, we now have a card that is 150% faster. Though at any of these frame rates, upscaling is needed, or a serious look at the quality settings to bring performance back in line. In Cyberpunk at 1440p, the 5070 Ti sits a margin of error 4% behind the RTX 4080, while also packing 13% more performance than both the 4070 Ti and 4070 Ti Super, that both come in identically at 40 FPS, with just a single frame separating them in the lows. The increase in performance from the 3070 Ti, which now sees 181% more frames, does mean that now we've gone from frankly unplayable to something that at least gives us scope to dial in the settings, or utilise upscaling, including frame generation. At 4K, the frame rates drop dramatically, and there isn't really much to talk about at such low levels of performance. It is nice to see the 5070 Ti matching the RTX 4080 in the averages though, and giving us 16% more performance than the RTX 4070 Ti Super, along with 38% more than the 4070 Ti non-Super, though the most impressive thing is how bad the 3070 Ti did here, which in turn gave us a 2,100% increase over the Ampere GPU. If only every result was like that, but sadly this is an anomaly and should be treated as such. Back to games that show a playable experience, and in F124 at 1440p with the quality set to ultra high, which gives us ray tracing, and the 5070 Ti is evenly matched with the RTX 4080, and again has some better, more refined 1% low figures. This also puts it 11% ahead of the 4070 Ti Super, 18% ahead of the 4070 Ti, and 84% ahead of the 3070 Ti. So again, some fairly decent gains for those wanting the best visuals at 1440p. As we move up to 4K, the 5070 Ti now pushes ahead of the RTX 4080 by a margin of error 3%, and again comes in with much stronger low figures to boot. This also means we now pack 17% more performance over the 4070 Ti Super, 26% more than the 4070 Ti, and 97% more than the 3070 Ti. So again, if you're looking to skip a generation, there's some good, strong performance on the table up for grabs. What this means for overall averages is that at 1080p it's a similar story to what we saw with ray tracing disabled, as the 5070 Ti is pretty evenly matched compared to the RTX 4080. It falls behind in the averages but makes up for it in the lows, and this again puts it 10% ahead of the 4070 Ti Super, and 12% ahead of the 4070 Ti Non-Super, and then 97% ahead of the 3070 Ti, showing a much bigger jump in ray tracing performance compared to that generation of cards. As we move to 1440, the fight with the RTX 4080 is still going on as the 5070 Ti again falls just behind in the averages but makes up for it in the lows. Compared to the 4070 Ti, we see an 11% uplift along with a 14% increase over the 4070 Ti Non-Super. But the bigger uplift comes when looking at the 3070 Ti, as we now have a 116% increase in performance just by skipping a generation and moving directly to the 5070 Ti. Then at 4K, the 5070 Ti does fall into somewhat unplayable levels depending on the games that you're playing, though it still holds a strong position against the RTX 4080 and comes in 13% faster than the 4070 Ti Super, and 19% better than the 4070 Ti Non-Super. Then lastly, looking at how things stack up with the 3070 Ti, we are now packing 144% more performance overall, showing that the latest ray tracing performance is much stronger compared to Ampere, but doesn't hold anything substantial when sizing up against the last generation. Next up, I want to take a look at upscaling, because being a 50 series card means that we have multi-frame generation technology included as standard, and I wanted to see what that actually does for our performance levels, especially when we look at games where frame rates were maybe lower because we were trying to maximize the quality presets and the overall settings. It's here where we booted up Alan Wake 2 to see what kind of an uplift we're actually able to get. And when looking at our native performance, we came in with 48 FPS, and, well, simply enabling DLSS gives us a 94% increase in frame rate, while also reducing latency by over 40%. When enabling multi-frame generation to X2, X3 and X4 modes, we see steady increases in performance until we're at the point of getting 245 frames per second, all while coming in with lower latency. That same trend follows with ray tracing enabled. Latency is much higher as ray tracing introduces that, but as we increase in performance from an unplayable 21 FPS at native to 158 FPS on the highest mode, this equates to a 652% increase in frames, while reducing latency by 50 milliseconds, putting this game into reach for those wanting to play on the higher settings. Cyberpunk shows a similar story, though we do have the option for the CNN or Transformer models to choose from. Again though, the trend shows that increasing the model to X2, X3 and then X4, that we find a steady increase in frame rates, and while the most aggressive model does introduce more latency, it's still lower than what we see at native. The only conclusion we can see is that the Transformer model does have slightly lower frame rates when comparing setting to setting across Transformer and CNN models, but CNN will typically give lower quality visuals and is a trade-off that you as a gamer can decide what you prefer. With ray tracing enabled, again the latency does increase with an FPS of 23 at native with 88 milliseconds of latency, but moving up the chart the performance increases dramatically while the latency halves. And again, while the X4 mode in both CNN and Transformer models see it increase to 60 milliseconds on both, that's still consistently lower than native, while also giving up to a 600% increase in performance. Now, as always, with upscaling, there's kind of three parts to the puzzle: performance in terms of frame rates, latency, and visuals. And while we've looked at the performance and the latencies, visuals can't be sacrificed too much, in my opinion, as, well, no one wants elite levels of performance if it means that the game looks, frankly, terrible. Now, if you do want to see more in-depth look at visuals, then I'd invite you to look at our other 50 series content as we go into it much deeper. But for this, I just want to look at some side-by-side visuals between native and the X4 mode to kind of show the difference, or in this case, maybe lack thereof. It's here where we find some, well, surprisingly small differences. Looking at finer details like the rubbish scattered on the floor, we can see a very slight loss of clarity when we enable frame generation, but not enough that you would notice anything while moving around and actually playing. Interestingly, the light on Alan Wake's back seems to fade just a bit quicker with frame generation enabled, and I'm not quite sure if this is a trick of the eye, but it does appear to cause ray tracing calculations to just maybe run a little bit faster, presumably because we are technically running at a lower resolution here, since DLSS is enabled. Moving on to Cyberpunk, we see such little differences at this resolution that, well, it's hard to tell that anything has changed at all. Obviously, there is some slight loss in the details on further away objects, like the skin and the merchant looking just a little bit smoother, for example, but that's really the bulk of the changes. Now, one other slight difference is in the fog, as when we enable frame generation, it appears to become slightly thicker, presumably due to DLSS being slightly unsure on how to handle the transparency of it. Overall though, you'd be hard pressed to notice any difference at all when comparing the two side by side. But with that being said, doing it this way doesn't take into account the artifacts introduced by frame generation, which I guess become noticeable when moving the camera, which is an issue that's been well documented online. So what about temperatures, power, fan speed and sustained GPU clocks? Well, that's where, performance to one side, we booted up F124 and put it into an hour-long loop to see just how the 5070 Ti holds up. And while the majority of this test comes down to the Ventus 3X cooler, it's safe to say, while MSI's Ventus cooler is good, this is an MSRP-based card. So non-MSRP, more premium cards will, of course, as you'd expect, perform better. It's in F1 after an hour that we saw our GPU and memory junction temperatures averaging around 64 degrees, though the memory junction temperature did fluctuate a little more, though even then we're only talking about 1 degree or so. This allowed for a sustained level of boost that averaged around 2677 MHz, with a single instance where it jumped above 2700 MHz, all while the fan speed remained pretty consistent at just under 1700 RPM, which wasn't really fast enough to be heard over the rest of the system's fans. Now, considering the 300 watt TDP of this card, it did actually keep under that limit throughout the run, averaging around 275 watts, with slight peaks at 280 and lows of 260. So rounding things off, it's always worth looking at the cost per frame to see just how things align. And, well, it's always a tricky one because having an MSRP price for an unreleased product is tricky. As well, you can be told that it has a price of this or a price of that. It doesn't actually mean that's what we're going to see it at. So in the interest of fairness, we do take a look at both MSRP and retail selling prices. At 1440p and looking at the MSRP pricing, the 5070 Ti is in a very good position, coming in at $3.85 per frame, only being beaten by the RTX 4070 Super and RX 7900 Gree from AMD. Now, this is actually a good move when we look at the cost per frame of the 4070 Ti Super at $4.42 per frame, and the non-Super at $4.58 per frame, though, of course, as mentioned, actual selling prices will differ, and I fear quite a lot. At 4K and sticking with MSRP, the 5070 Ti comes in even better in our standings, even if the cost per frame has now increased to $6.02 per frame. This puts it as one of the best value cards you can buy based on MSRP pricing, only being beaten by the RX 7900 Gree, though I think the most important metric that we do need to look at is, of course, that all-important retail selling price. When we look at the typical selling price, things do change, but actually not by much. For the sake of being fair, we've included in the 5070 Ti at its MSRP price of $749 and at $899, which is what both Micro Center and Best Buy have been shown to list them at, to give a more, let's call it, realistic offering. And at 1440p, the 5070 Ti still, even at the inflated price, looks pretty decent, especially considering you'd be paying the early adopter tax, and performance should get better as time goes on through driver updates and optimizations. Though so much of this really depends on other GPUs settling on price, which could happen as, well, these newer cards hit the shelves and, well, other cards may actually come down in price, though so much of that really comes down to availability. As we move up to 4K, it's very much the same. The cost per frame increases, as it would, but now puts it at worse value than the RX 7900 Gree, which is a card that now comes in at $6.09 per frame, and has only seen a small 3% increase in price since its launch. Now, this does make for a hard one to analyse because, well, costs are all over the place, and with a new card like this, so is availability, and there's always going to be gamers who, well, just aren't going to want to miss out, no matter the price. So as always, there is a lot of areas to go through, from rasterisation to Raytracing to upscaling to cost and kind of everything in between. So let's break things down into, I guess, the important parts, which I think mainly revolves around people looking to upgrade to this card. First and foremost, the RTX 5070 Ti is a big step up for those still on an RTX 3070 Ti, in some cases offering a massive 60 to 70% performance uplift in rasterisation and over 100% in ray tracing, making it one of the most substantial generational jumps that we've seen for this class of GPU. More importantly, it doubles the VRAM to 16GB of GDDR7 on a 256-bit bus, solving one of the biggest complaints about the 3070 Ti's limited 8GB frame buffer, which has clearly started to show its age a bit in modern titles. Now, compared to the RTX 4070 Ti and 4070 Ti Super, the 5070 Ti still brings noticeable improvements, but the margins aren't as dramatic. With 17% uplifts here and there over the 4070 Ti and 9% or so over the 4070 Ti Super, it doesn't necessarily make those cards obsolete, but it does offer a meaningful performance per dollar advantage, especially if you skip the 40 series and are looking for the best bang for your buck in the 70 class segment. Though as mentioned, pricing is a bit out of whack anyway, and well, that's a bit of a sore subject to talk about. Now, the pricing should have made the 5070 Ti a killer option, and at the announced MSRP of $749, this GPU easily justifies itself, slotting in close to the 4080 series in performance while staying just significantly cheaper. It also comes with NVIDIA's latest tech, like DLSS 4 with MFG, which dramatically improves performance, and along with Reflex, reduces latency, but only in supported titles. Though you could argue that that's better than what the competition are doing right now. And I guess in turn it, well, makes unplayable frame rates at 4K with Raytracing into something smooth and responsive, all while maintaining lower latency than native rendering and giving up something that maybe you didn't have the ability to have before, especially if you are going from a 30 series card. Now, the big problem is, and it is pricing, it's the MSRP pricing. It never lasts. And NVIDIA's recent track record with the 5080 and 5090 kind of tells us that the 5070 Ti is unlikely to be found at $749 for long, if at all. We've already seen retailers listing it at $899, which puts it in a very different competitive position. If it lands closer to $899 to $999, then suddenly the 4080 series and prospective AMD 9000 series cards become much more attractive alternatives. But even then, I, like many others, are frustrated. But it seems long gone are the days where a 70 Ti class would cost you $599, like the 3070 Ti did, and you'd, well, get it for that price. And that really is the frustrating part. As the 5070 Ti is a great GPU, it has strong generational performance if you're willing to skip a generation, excellent ray tracing if you're willing to skip a generation, and better upscaling capabilities. But if NVIDIA adds DLSS 4 to the 40 series, then again, if you skip a generation. It's a tough one. Overall, its value depends entirely on real-world pricing. If it stays close to MSRP, it's good. It's a good solid upgrade for those moving from the 3070 Ti, or even a 4070 Ti user looking for extra power without stepping into flagship pricing and wanting to harness the latest tech. But if inflated pricing and scalping take hold, and it will, it kind of loses its edge, making it a tougher sell in an already crowded GPU market. And with AMD's 9000 series on the horizon, NVIDIA and their partners, through both AIBs and retail, may need to do some rethinking. For now, yeah, the RTX 5070 Ti delivers on its promise of being a strong next-gen option. And if you can get it at MSRP, it is a solid buy. But as we've seen before, that's a big if. And, well, it's something we'll be watching closely in the coming weeks. For now, it's going to wrap this one up. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Will you be upgrading from the 30 series? Are you already on a 40 series GPU and are looking to upgrade, but now maybe don't see the point? Your feedback would actually be really good to see. Also, if you enjoyed this video, let us know by giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Also, if you love what we do and want to help support everything that we do, along with getting some cool and exclusive benefits, then you can join the super special Patreon club. The link is, as always, down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.